Valeria Montclair sat in the defendant's chair with an air of absolute confidence, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table, as if the entire courtroom was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Across from her, Judge Castor Hale watched in silence, his sharp eyes assessing the woman who had spent the entire trial treating the legal system like a joke. She had mocked the proceedings, scoffed at the evidence, and rolled her eyes at every warning. But what Valeria didn't realize, what she refused to believe, was that her arrogance had pushed her to the edge of a cliff, and Judge Hale was about to let her fall. Valeria Kemp strutted into the courtroom with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She walked past the rows of spectators without a hint of concern, as if the entire legal process was beneath her. Dressed in a tailored white suit and wearing diamond-studded earrings, she looked more like someone arriving at a business meeting than a defendant facing serious charges. Her high heels clicked against the polished floor, a sharp contrast to the tense silence that had settled over the room. She didn't bother to acknowledge the judge or the attorneys as she took her seat, instead pulling out her phone to check her notifications, her lips curling into a smirk. The case against her had been building for months. Investigators had uncovered proof that she had been fraudulently collecting government benefits while simultaneously running an unregistered online business that brought in tens of thousands of dollars each month. Social workers had also found her children living in squalor, neglected while she paraded her lavish lifestyle on social media. The evidence was overwhelming, but Valeria didn't seem concerned. In her mind, this was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, something she could talk her way out of, just like she had done so many times before. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case, detailing the fraudulent claims she had submitted and the lies she had told to continue receiving benefits she was not entitled to. They laid out bank records, screenshots of her extravagant spending habits, and testimonies from former acquaintances who had witnessed her deception firsthand. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of a woman who had exploited the system for her own personal gain, while neglecting the very children she was supposed to care for. As the prosecutor spoke, Valeria barely paid attention. She let out a dramatic sigh and leaned back in her chair, examining her nails as if the entire situation bored her. When one of the prosecutors displayed images of her children's living conditions, mattresses on the floor, an empty fridge, piles of dirty laundry, she rolled her eyes. To her, it was all an exaggeration. She had convinced herself that she was being unfairly targeted, that this was nothing more than an attack on her lifestyle by people who were jealous of her success. Murmurs spread through the courtroom as the weight of the accusations became clear, but Valeria remained unfazed. She crossed her arms, tapping her manicured nails against the table, her expression one of complete indifference. The judge, Leon Castor, observed her carefully. Known for his no-nonsense approach, he had presided over countless cases, but rarely had he encountered a defendant so openly dismissive of the legal process. He maintained his composure, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. When it was finally her attorney's turn to speak, Valeria straightened her posture slightly, but the confidence in her smirk never wavered. Her defense relied on the argument that the accusations against her were exaggerated, that the prosecution was twisting the truth to make her look like a criminal. They pointed out that she had no prior criminal record and attempted to portray her as a hard-working mother who had simply made some poor financial decisions. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. The bank records alone contradicted her claims, showing a steady stream of income that far exceeded the limits for government assistance. Then there was the testimony from her former nanny, who detailed how Valeria would leave the children unattended for days at a time while she traveled to luxury resorts, documenting her vacations online for her followers. It was damning, and even her own lawyer seemed to struggle to spin the situation in her favor. Despite the seriousness of the case, Valeria acted as if she was above it all. She glanced at her reflection in a compact mirror, adjusted her hair, and let out another sigh. Her entitled attitude was becoming more apparent with each passing moment, and those in the courtroom could sense that her behavior would only escalate. She had no respect for the process, no fear of the consequences. She truly believed she was untouchable. As the judge prepared to speak, the tension in the room grew heavier. All eyes were on Valeria, waiting to see how she would respond. No one could have predicted the spectacle that was about to unfold. The moment the judge began speaking, Valeria's impatience became even more obvious. She shifted in her seat, exhaling loudly as if enduring a pointless lecture. The courtroom had already been buzzing with murmurs about her arrogance, but now her complete disregard for authority was on full display. Judge Castor maintained his composure, speaking in a calm yet firm tone as he reminded her of the severity of the case against her. However, instead of listening, she tilted her head back in exaggerated boredom, making it clear she had no intention of taking anything seriously. The prosecutor continued laying out the facts, providing more evidence of her fraudulent activities. Screenshots from her social media accounts flashed on the screen. Pictures of her draped in expensive jewelry, sipping champagne on a private boat, and posing with designer handbags. All of it stood in stark contrast to the false financial reports she had submitted, claiming she had no means to support herself or her children. The jury watched in silence, their expressions shifting as they processed just how blatant her deception had been. Despite the mountain of evidence stacking against her, Valeria was unfazed. She casually adjusted the cuff of her suit and smirked. Her confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was the belief that she was untouchable. She had convinced herself that the rules applied to everyone else, not to her. As the prosecution detailed how her children had been found in a filthy apartment with no food while she flaunted luxury vacations, some members of the audience gasped. Valeria, however, remained unimpressed. She rolled her eyes, letting out a small chuckle, as if everything being said was beneath her. The judge took a brief pause, giving Valeria one last chance to compose herself. The room was silent, except for the scribbling of notes and the occasional shuffle of papers. Tension filled the air, thick and suffocating. The judge, who had seen countless defendants throughout his career, had rarely encountered someone so brazenly disrespectful. He gave her a sharp look, warning her without words that her attitude was leading her down a dangerous path. But Valeria wasn't the type to take warnings seriously. She let out an exaggerated sigh, leaned forward slightly, and shook her head, with a smirk. The prosecutor, sensing the rising tension, continued presenting statements from former friends and employees who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. One former employee, who had worked as her personal assistant, described how Valeria would force others to handle all responsibilities while she spent her days shopping and partying. Another statement detailed how she once refused to pay for a babysitter, leaving her young children alone overnight while she attended an exclusive event. The weight of the allegations was undeniable, yet Valeria remained indifferent. The judge turned his attention to her attorney, who appeared increasingly frustrated. Representing her had become a nightmare. Her refusal to take the case seriously had made it impossible to defend her. The judge asked a direct question regarding her financial situation, giving her the opportunity to explain herself, but instead of responding appropriately, she scoffed. She threw up her hands and laughed under her breath, shaking her head as if the entire trial was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The reaction from the spectators was immediate. People exchanged glances, shocked by her blatant disregard for the court. Some whispered among themselves, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Even the prosecutor, who had dealt with difficult defendants before, appeared momentarily, stunned by her audacity. Valeria, however, thrived on attention. The more people reacted, the more emboldened she became. She straightened her posture and spoke loudly, making sarcastic remarks about how ridiculous the case was. Her voice carried across the room, her words laced with amusement and condescension. Her attorney buried his face in his hands, realizing that any hope of leniency was slipping away. The judge's patience was visibly wearing thin. He adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and tried once more to maintain control of the courtroom. But Valeria was far too caught up in her own arrogance to recognize the shift in atmosphere. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and smirked, as if daring the judge to challenge her further. The spectators, the prosecution, and even her own legal team could sense it. Something was about to happen. The judge had given her multiple chances to show even the slightest bit of respect, but she had ignored every single one. The tension in the room grew unbearable, and the realization set in. Valeria had pushed too far. She was about to face a reality she never thought possible. Judge Castor remained silent for a long moment, his sharp gaze locked on Valeria as the weight of the courtroom settled heavily on everyone inside. The air was thick with tension, an almost suffocating stillness stretching between the judge's patience and Valeria's unrelenting arrogance. The courtroom had seen its fair share of difficult defendants, but never one so openly defiant. The judge had given her multiple opportunities to correct her behavior, yet she had dismissed each warning as if they were insignificant. Her entitled smirk remained, her posture relaxed, exuding the same cocky indifference that had followed her since the trial began. The judge shifted slightly in his chair, exhaling as he prepared to address her once more. His tone remained composed, but there was a firm edge to it, a finality that even those unfamiliar with legal proceedings could recognize. He reiterated the charges against her, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. He reminded her that this was not a game, that the consequences of her actions were severe, and that her conduct in the courtroom was only making matters worse. He urged her to conduct herself with the level of respect expected in a court of law. For a brief moment, there was silence. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting to see if Valeria would finally understand the weight of the situation. But instead of taking the opportunity to redeem herself, she did the exact opposite. She let out an exaggerated sigh and threw her hands up in exasperation. Her eyes rolled so dramatically that the movement was visible even from the back of the courtroom. Then, in an act of sheer defiance, she leaned back in her chair and muttered a sarcastic remark under her breath, loud enough for the judge and everyone else to hear. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by stunned silence. Even her own attorney stiffened, his face draining of color as he realized what had just happened. The prosecutor slowly shook their head, almost in disbelief that she had taken it this far. The judge's expression darkened, the patience he had displayed for so long completely gone. His posture straightened, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the defendant before him. It was at that moment that Valeria finally seemed to notice the shift in the room. The smirk on her lips twitched slightly, her confidence faltering just for a second. But she recovered quickly, brushing it off as if nothing had happened. She didn't believe for a second that she would face real consequences. She had spent years manipulating people, bending rules in her favor, and getting away with anything she wanted. In her mind, this was no different. But she had underestimated the one person in the room who had absolute authority over her fate. Judge Castor didn't need to raise his voice or show anger to make his decision clear. He calmly stated that Valeria's actions had reached an unacceptable level. Her blatant disrespect for the court, her mocking demeanor, and her repeated defiance had left him with no choice. His words were clear, final, and absolute. She was now held in contempt of court. A stunned hush fell over the room. Valeria blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The meaning of his words took a second to register, but when they did, her arrogance flickered into something else. Confusion. She let out a short laugh, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. But the judge was already instructing the bailiffs to approach. The shift in energy was undeniable. This was not a warning. This was not a threat. This was a consequence, and, for the first time, Valeria had no control over it. The bailiffs moved swiftly, stepping toward her with practiced authority. The moment their presence became undeniable, the realization crashed down on her. Her smirk vanished, her body tensing. She raised her hands in protest, as if to argue, but it was too late. Her attitude had sealed her fate. The entire courtroom watched in silence, knowing that she had done this to herself. There would be no more warnings, no more chances. The entitled woman who had spent the entire trial mocking the system was now facing the harsh reality of what defying the law truly meant. Valeria's breath quickened as the bailiffs closed in. The confidence she had worn like a shield throughout the trial was now cracking, replaced by something she had never allowed herself to feel: fear. She wasn't untouchable anymore. For the first time, she realized that this wasn't a game, and the authority she had mocked had the power to take control away from her. The judge had spoken, and there was no room for negotiation. The courtroom was no longer a stage for her arrogance. It was now the setting of her downfall. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, her movements sharp and defensive. Her arms went up as though to ward off the approaching officers, but they weren't fazed. This wasn't the first time they had escorted a disruptive defendant out of a courtroom, and it wouldn't be the last. They moved with precision, their expressions unreadable. Unlike the people Valeria had manipulated in the past, these officers weren't susceptible to her charm or her tricks. Their job was to enforce the court's decision, and that was exactly what they intended to do. A murmur swept through the crowd as people watched, eyes wide with anticipation. The entitled woman, who had dismissed every warning, rolled her eyes at the evidence and laughed at the accusations against her, was now being forced to face reality. Valeria's attorney shifted, uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his temples as if hoping to wake up from a nightmare. He had tried to keep her in check, had silently prayed she would recognize the danger of her behavior, but she hadn't. Now, there was nothing he could do. As the bailiffs reached for her, Valeria jerked back, her face twisting in frustration. She wasn't used to being handled like this. She had always been in control, always found a way to talk her way out of trouble, but there was no way to charm or intimidate her way out of this moment. Her voice rose, her words frantic and sharp, as she demanded that they stop, that they reconsider, that they understand who she was. She grasped at whatever she could, trying to reassert the dominance she had always relied on. But her words meant nothing. The judge had already moved on, his focus now on the next matter at hand. To him, Valeria was no longer a defendant to be reasoned with. She was an individual who had disrespected the court, and she would be dealt with accordingly. His expression was calm, composed, unwavering. He had handled far worse, and a woman who had let entitlement blind her to the reality of her situation was hardly going to shake him. Valeria's protests turned to outrage, her voice rising even higher as she threw accusations at the court, at the judge, at the system. She called it unfair, corrupt, a personal attack against her. But the more she shouted, the less anyone listened. The courtroom was no longer reacting to her outbursts. The spectators had already drawn their conclusions, and her words held no weight. No one was shocked anymore. No one felt sympathy. The bailiffs took firm hold of her arms, their grip unyielding but not aggressive. They had done this enough times to know how to handle people like her. People who only understood the consequences of their actions when it was far too late. Valeria struggled at first, but resistance was useless. The more she fought, the more ridiculous she looked. Her once pristine appearance was now disheveled, her carefully composed image unraveling with each passing second. As they led her toward the exit, the finality of what was happening settled in. Her entitled bravado had carried her through life, but it had finally reached its limit. She had spent years bending rules, manipulating people, and assuming the world would always cater to her. But here, in this courtroom, none of that mattered. The law didn't care about her money, her social status, or her ability to talk her way out of trouble. The law cared about respect, order, and justice, and Valeria had spat in its face too many times. The doors swung open, and the last thing the courtroom saw of her was a glimpse of panic flashing in her eyes before she was taken away. The woman who had walked in with the arrogance of someone who believed she was above the system had just learned the hardest lesson of her life. She was no longer in control. And for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to have no power at all. Valeria's heels clicked sharply against the cold, polished floor as she was led down the hallway toward the holding cells. The sound echoed off the walls, each step dragging her further away from the life she once knew. The courtroom was behind her now, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her chest like an anchor. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and no amount of arrogance could shield her from it anymore. She had never imagined herself in this position. Jail was for other people, people who made poor choices, people who lacked intelligence or power. Not for her. She had always believed she was different, untouchable, above the rules that applied to everyone else. But now, as the bailiffs guided her toward processing, she was forced to confront the truth. She wasn't special here. She wasn't feared, admired, or envied. She was just another person in custody, subject to the same procedures as anyone else who had defied the court. The intake room was sterile and unwelcoming, stripped of any warmth or luxury. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting an unflattering glare over everything. The officers worked methodically, unfazed by her presence. She wasn't the first person who had walked in with entitlement dripping from every pore, and she wouldn't be the last. They moved efficiently, taking her fingerprints, recording her information, and logging her into the system. The entire process was cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the life she had built on status and appearances. As they handed her a standard orange jumpsuit, her stomach twisted. The fabric was rough, stiff, and unfamiliar. It wasn't tailored, wasn't expensive, wasn't something she had chosen. For the first time in years, she had no control over what she wore, where she went, or how she was perceived. She had spent so much of her life ensuring that she was always in charge, always the one dictating the terms. Now she was just another inmate, stripped of her power and left to face the consequences of her actions. The moment the cold steel bars slid shut behind her, reality crashed down on her in full force. The small cell was nothing like the lavish home she was used to. There was no plush furniture, no extravagant decor, no luxury. Just a metal bunk, a thin mattress, and walls that seemed to close in on her. The silence was suffocating. She had always been surrounded by noise, people talking, music playing, the hum of expensive cars and exclusive parties. Now, there was nothing, just her own thoughts, echoing louder than ever before. She sank onto the hard mattress, her hands gripping the edge of the bunk as she tried to steady herself. For the first time, fear crept into her mind, gnawing at the edges of her confidence. There was no way to manipulate her way out of this. No amount of charm or empty promises would change the fact that she had been held in contempt, that she had been sentenced to jail, and that her freedom had been stripped away in an instant. Hours passed slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. She replayed the courtroom scene in her mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment she had lost control. Had it been when she rolled her eyes? When she scoffed at the judge's warning? When she laughed, believing she was untouchable? Every action, every smirk, every dismissive remark had led her here, and now there was nothing she could do to undo it. The whispers of other inmates drifted through the air, distant but inescapable. She wasn't alone in this place, but she had never felt more isolated. She had spent so long looking down on others, believing herself superior, that she had never considered what it would be like to be in their position. Now she was, and there was no escape. Sleep didn't come easily that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the bars that enclosed her. Her arrogance had built a wall around her for years, shielding her from the reality of consequences. But now, that wall had crumbled. She had no control, no power, no influence. Just time. Time to think. Time to realize that, in the end, entitlement had given her nothing but a prison cell.